Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to episode number 43 of Uncommon Sense. Dean Holmes and Craig Kamanis here. For those of you listening or watching live on LinkedIn, hello to you. And anyone else watching or listening after hours, of course, hello to you as well. So, Craig, over to you for the big introduction for today.
The introduction. Good afternoon, Dean. It's great to be here for number 43. So, what are we going to call and talk about today, mate? Some people call it a debrief. Some people call it a hot wash, a wrap up, a post-mortem. In extreme circumstance, I've heard it as a mishap investigation. It could be formal, it could be internal, it could be external, it could be informal, or it could be personal. But what we want to talk about today, Dean, is the debrief and debriefing all of the actions that we take and covering off on what Wharton Business School calls an after-action review of pretty much all of the things that we do for our business and even personally throughout our lives. And we were chatting about it this morning, Dean. We thought, why the hell not bring it to our listeners? Because it's a great topic and something that's important.
Absolutely. So unfortunately, you're not wearing your Wharton jumper at the moment,
No.
but for those listening and following, Craig Kamanis did buy it at the gift shop on the way out. But the after action review is something that was taught to you at Wharton. So why don't you initially take us through the framework, and then we'll talk through a couple of examples of how this can actually translate into our own businesses and life and things like that.
Yep. So I think, the most important part is, whilst we're talking today, Dean, about this being sort of like a formal kind of process that you put into your business, when you actually run the framework, you've almost got to try and take the formality out of it and create a relaxed environment for the people who are part of the after action review. And there's going to be a leader who's kind of working through that after action review. But if you are the leader of that team, in this instance, you've got to kind of be careful not to try and play that role, but lead the facilitation and the discussion of the after action review and make sure that people are willing to speak up and actually say what they think and not what they think you want to hear if you're that leader. So maybe a tip is to get someone else to lead the framework if you are the natural people leader of that team. But anyway, the process is that it's 4 simple questions that you work through. And we did this, Dean, just as an aside. The way we did this at Wharton was a guy called John came in and sent us off in teams all around the campus to complete all these sort of amazing race type challenges. And so then we had to do this afterwards. So the first thing is, what did you intend? That is the first really simple question in this after action review to ask, is what did you intend? And it should be a pretty simple answer because you know what you were going in to do, regardless.
Well, interestingly, you're absolutely right, Craig. It should be easy to answer. But if we just double click on these as we go through, it's interesting that we actually realize that setting the scope of what you intend to do is really important. So the idea of asking that, what we're kind of laughing of such a simple question, i.e., what do you intend to accomplish? Like, in order to have the ability to answer that at the end, you have to really have well defined that at the outset of taking this particular action, whether simple or complicated.
Yep, most definitely. And then the second question in the after action review, Dean, is what actually happened?
Yep.
And to work through, okay, this is what we intended to do. This is what actually happened now. Thirdly, if there was a gap, whether that be positive or negative, why did it occur?
Yep.
And then the last one is, what would you do differently next time? 4 really simple questions that, if done appropriately, expose a whole heap of information that is going to be very, very, very useful to people. Now, they're the 4 questions, Dean, right? Sorry, did you have something you wanted to comment on those?
I was just going to ask ourselves, so we could talk about it, and you might be going to touch on this, about how we actually facilitate that in a team context, whether you're physically or digital, doesn't really matter. But how are we going to facilitate those steps in the conversation in a team context?
Yep. So the key is actually in the spirit of how it's actually done, right? And so whether it's on video with your team or in a room or having a coffee in a coffee shop or however, it becomes the spirit. So the first thing, it has to be depersonalized. It's got to be what, not who. Because you do not want to start an after-action review going, well, we're unorganized on UncommonCents because Dean didn't give me a topic this morning and I didn't know what I was going to talk about. That's what actually happens most weeks, isn't it? Anyway, and Dean did this and Dean did that. Like, that's not how you want to run an after-action review. It needs to be what, not who.
Okay.
You also need to make sure that everyone contributes. So you can't have silent passengers just sitting there nodding or not or whatever. They've got to speak up. So if they're in the after-action review, they've got to be talking and sharing their experience.
Yep, absolutely.
And my advice on that is, if you've got people in that room who aren't talking, then they just shouldn't be in the room. You've actually picked the wrong people for the after-action review.
Yeah.
You've got to have a focus. So you've got to make sure people understand the intent of the questions and are focused on delivering an outcome that allows you to go, how did it all work? What did like through those questions, right? So it's got to be focused.
Understood.
And no blame. So even if you kind of know someone did something as part of that, you can't bring blame into it because you'll shut the process down as well.
Yep.
And really that's what you're trying to fight against, is not shutting this process down.
Correct. So I think the two things that's really important. So this concept of the leader, whoever that is has to be this at the minimum facilitating and hopefully also speaking last in the process, so that the room can be heard first and then the leader can speak towards the end of the process. I think that's a really good, valuable lesson there. I have read recently, but I can't remember the company, but there's this thing going around where new managers to this particular company, and if I find it out, I'll let you know, but new managers are not allowed to speak in meetings for the first 3 months of their employment.
Wow.
Amazingly, because they have to, the context is you've got to listen before you can actually dictate, right? Or manage at the end of the day. And so the danger is speaking too soon. But in this context, we want to make sure that everyone is speaking, but towards the end is where the leader is speaking. And this removing of the blame by just speaking about what happened, as opposed to going, Craig did this or Craig didn't do this, I think is key.
Yeah.
So what have we got in terms of the case studies that Wharton gave you? And then we'll talk about a couple of other kind of more practical ones as well.
Yeah, so they provided us with the Space Shuttle's Challenger and Columbia. And Challenger in 1986, obviously everyone knows, well, hopefully everyone knows the story. Challenger wasn't very successful, but...
well, 1986, Craig, you're in trouble there for some of our listeners.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes, continue. It was the rocket. Yes,
rocket
I think everyone can understand the end.
Yes. Like, tragedy, right? And what caused that was a failed O-ring. Probably one of the cheapest parts on a rocket ship you could think of is what caused that. And Columbia, which was another one in 2003, so others might know, that Columbia wasn't successful, but that technical issue was wing damage due to foam. I don't understand exactly what it was, but again, it was something that looks like it could have been avoided. And so what they talked to us about at Wharton is that whilst there was different technical issues, there was similar root causes. And the causes were actually effective communication between departments.
Yep.
What they say about Challenger here, Dean, was that there was incomplete and sometimes misleading information due to a conflict between engineering data and management judgments. So no one was talking to each other, and then no one was believing in each other's data, and they just wanted to go anyway. So we'll go. And then all of a sudden we have to do an after-action review because we've had tragedy. Like, this is serious, like, consequences. And we leak it back to a failed O-ring because we didn't communicate.
Correct. And so what can we learn from that in terms of our businesses today and dealing with not only our small businesses potentially, Craig, but also the third parties, is that the communication is vital in the process, whether it's the handover. And I've spoken about this before about why doctors give a handover on top of the patients, which is all about making sure that the patient themselves is listening and sometimes participating in that handover, so that information is transferred correctly. And this whole thing of management potentially making decisions on behalf of a department or a business without actually really understanding that particular role or job and not involving those parties in the process at all. So tragedy and interesting learnings through that process, Craig, that the same problem was repeated in that organization. Yes, it's a long time in between, but 20 years later, or thereabouts, the same similar thing happened in terms of an organizational failure to hear from different departments.
Yep. And sometimes, Dean, the doctor example, elaborate that on a little bit more for us, please, mate. But that came down to people not wanting to speak up, right? Because they didn't feel like
absolutely. So this concept exists, and you can Google the words never events. And so quite practically, they were called never events because they were never meant to happen. And so the common ones that go through the literature is actually they amputated the wrong limb. So they took the left arm instead of the right arm or leg. So that never should have happened in that context. And the leaving of equipment inside human bodies, be it a towel or some type of scalpel or something to that effect. But those events should never have happened. It's not an accident. There should be a process to avoid these things. And the research looked back at why it was happening, and it was actually because of the hierarchy of the doctor versus other people and support staff within the room. So let's just say doctors and nurses for this example. So the hierarchy between doctors and nurses was actually preventing nurses speaking up, and it was actually elevating doctors to this elitist status, so they wouldn't actually listen to nurses even if they had the confidence to speak up. So it was two teams working on the one outcome, which was amputating a limb, but they weren't communicating together as to what was going on. And so the reality of what happens now and how they've learnt from that is they're drawing with Texter with the patient being involved in the process. So I'd talk to you, Craig, and go, now, Craig, I'm going to cut off your right arm. Do you agree with that? And I would write with Texter, cut here on the right arm, for example. And so that keeps the patient involved, which is really important in checking that. But it's just one step in a many-step process where they're constantly checking their work now. And so that has come, the processes that now exist have come out of the after action review. You had a few other buzzwords for it. Probably post-mortem is an inappropriate one to say.
Yeah, probably.
The after action review through the medical industry has actually found out that they needed to change some of the core practices in terms of how they operated within an operating room.
Yeah, and I guess, Dean, the other extent and a good example of after action review, debrief, whatever, is you and I got to attend a fantastic conference recently, and the last speaker was a guy called Harry Moffat.
Absolutely.
Who is an ex-SAS troop. Talk us through what he spoke about.
Yeah, so Harry, absolutely. So at the end of any mission that they did overseas, Harry served in Afghanistan amongst other places, the SAS would have a debrief or this after action review, and they went around in the circle in exactly the same way that we're talking today, with everyone giving feedback in terms of frank and honest feedback, and it even got as detailed as their feelings in relation to being scared or not scared. And so that was really important to get that out on the table as part of this review. But the most important thing that I took away from what Harry was talking about in terms of this review is that it happened immediately after they got back to base. So obviously the review was happening when they were safe, but it was happening immediately. So the way he explained it is the helicopter landed, they all got off, the helicopter took off, and they stood there and did the after action review. And so the reason why we want to do this immediately is because everyone's memory of events change the seconds and hours after that particular moment. So the best time you can do the review is actually immediately after the event, because that's when it's freshest in everyone's mind first and foremost, and everyone is there and able to participate. The moment if you leave that moment and go off, everyone's gone off to do their own things, and this is more just life in general as opposed to war. But if you think about it, that you had a 4-person meeting and you walk out of the meeting and you don't debrief there, someone's got to go pick up their kids, someone's got to go home, someone's got another meeting to go to afterwards. When are you actually going to get back and do the debrief?
Yeah. And mate, the evidence is growing for this, right? So we've got Harry, talking about his circumstance and doing that. We've got those examples that we spoke about at Wharton. We know our good friend Andy Fell talks about the debrief, and we mentioned that in the wrap up in a previous episode about part of that. You yourself with the Wealth Network talk to this about the businesses that you coach. So let's divert it back a little bit to advice businesses, which is hopefully most of our listeners. What are some of the things that you're guiding the people you coach to debrief on and to really
Indeed. So the first element of debriefing, and it's probably the one that's the most common in terms of business development or when you've been trained in sales, is to do the debrief at the end of at the end of that first or second client meeting. So the element of the debrief is that just because you're on your own doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Okay. So debriefing with yourself is as equally as powerful as debriefing with someone else. And so that the important thing there is that if you're going into any meeting with a client, at the end of the meeting, you should be taking the time to debrief your performance in that meeting. Now, if you've got someone with you, you absolutely can do it back and forth with that particular person that was attending the meeting, not the prospective client, but your associate or something. But if you do not have someone to debrief with, you still need to follow a process of debriefing yourself. And so I think first and foremost, Craig, debriefing all of your meetings is vital. I always talk about meetings as your grand final. And so the context I often talk about that is in relation to trying new things. And so I encourage people not to try new things in the grand final day. So if you think of any sporting analogy and sporting team, and you're like, why did that team lose? And it's like they tried something new, right? Or something risky and things like that. So you never try new moves or strategies on grand final day. And I do the same thing with client meetings, is don't try something new for the first time unless you practice it. But once you practice it a few times, then you're actually going to do it in a meeting. You have to do it in a meeting. But the debrief then becomes important in that context, Craig, because then you can actually reflect on what you did or what you didn't do and how you're going to do it better next time. If you don't do it immediately straight after the meeting, which is Harry's point, you will forget what happened in that meeting. You've written a file note, you've written all the notes of the discussions, you're not taking notes on how you've performed during that meeting. So that's why you've got to create the time for yourself after the meeting to do the debrief.
Yeah.
So that not only is with client meetings, Craig, it's actually could be with any meeting that you have with anyone. So the idea of meeting with an accountant, a business, a BDM from a product provider, or having an internal staff meeting or performance review with a staff member, any meeting interaction, first and foremost, you can definitely debrief. It could be shorter, in terms of meeting with a BDM, for example, but you can still debrief and ask yourself, did I properly explain the business? Does that person know what my target client is? Like, you can still debrief and ask yourself some questions about how the meeting went.
Yep.
The furthest extent you can take this to, Craig, is you can debrief any and all activities that you do. Now, it might sound funny when I say I'm going to send an email to the client and then debrief about how well did I send that email. That does sound funny. But if I can just challenge you in that, before you hit send, do you debrief by rereading the email once to make sure it's appropriate for the client? And so the element of the debrief is check your work in the simplicity of an email. But in terms of how you might like to do the work that you get done, so I love the Pomodoro technique, which is focus work for 25 minutes. The idea of doing one Pomodoro, 25 minutes worth of work, and then spending 1 minute at the end of that 25 minutes, seeing how well you performed in those last 25 minutes and just going, hey, I got distracted 3 times. Hey, I got through a lot. Or B, which is actually pretty common, I started doing my thing, my task that I wanted to focus on. At the end of the 25 minutes, I found myself doing something completely different. That will happen more often than not. But you need the debrief to actually pull yourself up on that particular activity so that you can do more high value work. And so this element of the debrief can go through anything and everything that you do.
Yeah. And I think that's critically important, is building in the discipline to make sure you're doing the debrief.
Absolutely. So Craig and I laughed because we were like, well, what's our debrief at the end of Uncommon Sense? And we had a little chuckle and we say, well, we turn off the stream first and foremost. We kind of look at one another and we say, oh, that was pretty good. And we do a fist bump to the screen and we say, see you next week. And so that was a challenge to ourselves to actually realize that we're not putting as much effort as we probably should be in terms of debriefing our activities. And so we're both going to watch this one back, Craig, and talk about how we performed, because we want the next 43 versions of Uncommon Sense after this one to be better. So everyone's got a desire to be better when they go and do any activity. But the question is, what activity and actions are you taking to actually get better?
And one of the live debriefs right now, Dean, is that you should make sure you have water if you're going to be talking a lot, particularly to a live audience, because now I'm dry and I want to keep coughing. So we need to talk about water in our debrief.
So good to know. You need a drink and keep yourself healthy in that context. So yes, the challenge and opportunity of live TV is great, and anyone can go live in this modern world, of course. So Craig, that's excellent. So I think the last thing that I wanted to mention just in this context, just to continue to learn from other industries, which is something that I'm always focused on. We spoke about sporting teams a little bit before, but it's a relatively known fact that Mondays are TV days for sports people, in terms of, if you think about your favorite footy team, is that they get together on the Monday and they re-watch the match that they played on the weekend. Win or lose, they re-watch the match. And it's even, technology is even better in some of these football teams now, where there's multiple cameras in the stadium following individual players. So an individual player can watch back their game as opposed to the game and see all the movements that they did both on and off the ball, whether it's football, soccer, or rugby league. You can see how you positioned yourself in every single play of every single part of the match, and everyone sits down and watches it, and people within the organization watch those videos as well, not just the sports people, to allow those sports people to improve for the next time. And so technology is helping us do that, and we're recording Uncommon Sense, which means that we can watch the video content back to see how we looked at the camera and connected with the audience, what our audio sounded like, things like that. And so when we've recorded a client meeting now, to bring it back to financial planning businesses, Craig, we can actually rewatch the recording to see how good or bad the elements of those meetings were. And so I recorded everything I did yesterday for our quarterly planning, and I can go back and watch different elements of that to see what was it like from the customer's experience in terms of what I was delivering, as opposed to what I thought I was doing.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Dean, because I would assume most people who are currently recording client meetings are doing it from a governance perspective, which is fantastic.
Yes, correct.
But there's actually this whole other element that you're opening yourself up to if you do debriefing correctly, where you can now actually use it for something else other than that. So the investment in that time and technology and energy to do it can reap rewards far past, making sure that you've got all the details you need from a governance perspective, but more into your performance in the meeting and how that actually went.
Indeed, indeed. And if you say something amazing in that meeting, now you can go back and get the sound bite as well and reuse that if that's something important as well. So yeah, I think the video context and rewatching our work is really valuable. I do, if you've ever called the Commonwealth Bank or anyone similar to that, the phone lines are recorded, of course. But what they say as the reason why the phone call is recorded, I think they say for quality and training purposes. Yeah. Now, the asterisk on that is actually compliance. But think about it, this video meeting is being recorded for quality and training assurance. Like, that's actually a really positive thing. And potentially as we're going into this path of recording all client meetings, the script in which we say around client meetings is really important. And a positive spin around that is for this quality and training is that we want to get better. So we're recording our videos and we all watch it back at a later date.
And on that, Dean, that could be a great way to wrap up UncommonCents number 43. We need some extra time today so we can debrief when we go off the air. So I think, it's a really great topic. I hope people enjoyed it, and I hope that you actually take the step and implement and build that habit into your business, because we know that it'll genuinely help. So, Dean, thanks today.
You're welcome, Craig. Look forward to the debrief momentarily when we hit off the call.
Yes.
But this was episode 43, ladies and gentlemen. So thanks very much for watching. If you watch this live or later on LinkedIn, please leave some comments, a like, and share the content with our audience. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Bye, everyone.